Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to the release of our report, A Rising Tide in Graduation Rates at the California State University, a Persistent Divide in Racial Equity, a progress report on the Graduation Initiative 2025. I'm Jessie Ryan, Executive Vice President of the Campaign for College Opportunity. Today, we will share progress towards meeting the goals of the Graduation Initiative 2025, launched in 2015 by the CSU to support more students at 23 campuses to cross the graduation stage, eliminate persistent racial equity gaps, and meet California's future workforce needs. For nearly 20 years, the Campaign for College Opportunity has also worked tirelessly to ensure that students are supported in accessing and completing their college dreams, with an unapologetic focus on dismantling inequitable systems. Today's critical conversation comes at a moment when many students and families are questioning the value of pursuing their degrees, as well as their belonging on campus communities. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be shared across our social media channels in the coming days as we redouble our efforts to push to illuminate the disaggregated data, to inform necessary student supports, to focus more intentionally on scaling the types of bold solutions necessary to close unacceptable racial equity gaps that have existed for far too long. After our panel conversation, we're going to have an opportunity for the audience to engage in Q&A. So please drop your questions in the Q&A box so that we're able to answer them live. Finally, we encourage each of you to download and read the report and to continue the conversation with the hashtag GI2025 and Rising Tide Persistent Divide. That's hashtag Rising Tide Persistent Divide. Our team will be sharing links throughout the webinar. We know that California boasts a world-class education system. Our state understands that it's essential to support our students to both access and succeed in college. We know that today, more than ever, pursuing a four-year degree is imperative for the future of students, their families, communities, and California. The California State University system is a beacon of light for so many, one of the largest public university systems in the country, serving a diverse student population of over 400,000 across 23 campuses. As a proud San Francisco State alum, who was the first in my family to graduate from college, struggling with housing and food insecurity along the way, I know firsthand how the CSU, also known as the People's University, plays a vital role in lifting families out of poverty, meeting the demand for a diverse, well-educated California workforce. And while the CSU's commitment to admitting significant numbers of qualified California residents helps ensure that higher ed is both accessible in California and that students from all income levels across the state and all racial and ethnic groups have access, we know that graduation rates are still far too low. And that signals that the current practices are insufficient to support all students. A student's zip code shouldn't determine their destiny. A Black student should know that they are being supported to succeed at Cal Poly SLO, just as they're being supported to succeed at San Diego State University. Today, you'll hear from a detailed analysis of both the successes of the Graduation Initiative 2025, as well as the urgent demand for improvement. Meeting this moment is going to require a Herculean effort, but our students deserve no less. We're going to share a series of recommendations on actions that policymakers, the CSU Board of Trustees, our new chancellor, as well as the 23 campuses can take to meet the graduation goals set forth by the GI 2025. And most importantly, to close racial equity gaps once and for all and continue the momentum beyond 2025. We're also going to have a robust panel discussion with a group of phenomenal racial equity educators and leaders. including San Diego State Associated Student Vice President of External Relations, Melvin Ridley III, professor and co-founding director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab at San Diego State, Dr. Frank Harris III, and associate vice chancellor of student success and inclusive excellence at the CSU Chancellor's Office, Dr. Jennifer Bazil, who will reflect on the report findings as well as share their perspective on how we move forward from here. And finally, we're going to have a chance to answer questions from all of you. But before I turn the program over to our first presenter, I'd like to offer a sincere gratitude to all the people who made this report possible. Reviewers like Jorge Haynes, Colleen Moore, Dr. Christopher Nellam, the Executive Director at Education Trust West, Peter Taylor, Trustee Emeritus at the CSU Board of Trustees and former President of ECMC Foundation, as well as Jacob Jackson, a research fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. We also would be remiss if we didn't thank our entire team for their tremendous hard work, especially our principal author, Michelle Siqueiros, president of the Campaign for College Opportunity, with data support and analysis from our phenomenal senior research analyst, David Drummer, and our vice president of research, Dr. Vikash Reddy. It's now my pleasure to introduce our fearless leader, the president of the Campaign for College Opportunity and principal author of Rising Tide in Graduation Rates at the California State University, A Persistent Divide in Racial Equity, Michelle Siqueiros.
Thank you, Jessie, and thank you everyone for tuning in to this conversation. You have all heard the saying, a rising tide lifts all boats. At the campaign, we've long been aware of the flaws in this saying. While we celebrate the gains in graduation rates across the CSU system, not all students are being lifted equally by the tide. Today's report, you'll see that the CSU has seen historic growth in graduation rates. 35% of CSU first-time students currently graduate within 4 years. This is almost double the rate from 2015. And in 6 years, that rate has grown to 62%. And it's grown in large part because of the graduation initiative and the hard work at each of the CSU campuses. We are celebrating the fact that there is a CSU GI 2025 initiative, and there's much to celebrate here. So I'm excited to share the findings in this report. As we all know, the CSU is undeniably an economic engine for California. It provides critical access to a 4-year degree, especially for historically underserved students. As you can see pictured here, today, over 2/3 of both first-time and transfer students to the CSU are Latinx, Black, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander, or American Indian Alaska Native. But access to the CSU is not enough. Students must earn their degree if they want to participate in our knowledge-based economy and reap the many social benefits a degree provides, including access to home ownership, a living wage job, access to health care and health insurance. And we know that college-educated Californians are more active in their civic life, in voting, and less reliant on social services. So let's start with the good news in this report. I'm excited to share that among all first-time students, the CSU 4-year graduation rate, as I mentioned earlier, has nearly doubled, increasing from what it was only 19% in 2015 to 35% in 2022. The 6-year graduation rate has also increased, although more modestly, from 57% in 2015 to 62% in 2022. The 2-year graduation rate for transfer students has increased from 31% in 2015 to 40% in 2022. And the 4-year graduation rate for transfer students also increased from 73% to 80%. The system is on track to meet one of the goals of a 40% graduation rate after 4 years for first-time students. 13 of the CSU campuses have made extensive progress in closing equity gaps in the 6-year graduation rate for first-time students, and 14 campuses have made progress in closing equity gaps in 4-year graduation rates for transfer students. 8 CSU campuses noted here: East Bay, Fresno, Long Beach, Maritime, Northridge, San Luis Obispo, Sonoma, and Stanislaus have also made commendable strides in closing equity gaps in both the 6-year graduation rate for first-time students and the 4-year rates for transfer students. These are all laudable improvements to celebrate, and we urge the CSU to continue this momentum. But as our analysis shows, there is definite room for improvement, particularly to support Black, Latinx, and American Indian Alaska Native students who the CSU categorizes as underrepresented minorities, or URM, a term that we find very problematic, and we'll speak to that later. Despite increases in graduation rates, including for Black, Latinx, and AIAN, which are American Indian Alaska Native students, equity gaps remain unacceptably high, at around 11 or 12 points overall. Each of the 23 CSU campuses have differing goals to improve the 4- and 6-year graduation rates. And we found in our analysis that even if each campus met its exact individual goal, the system would not meet 3 of the 4 system-wide Graduation Initiative 2025 goals. Our analysis indicates that if current trends hold, in fact, the CSU will likely fall short of a 45% 2-year graduation rate for transfer students and an 85% 4-year graduation rate for transfer students. As of 2022, the CSU is not on track to meet its goal of a 70% graduation rate after 6 years for first-time students. Only 7 of the 23 CSU campuses currently have a 40% or higher 4-year graduation rate goal, and only 8 CSU campuses have a 70% or higher 6-year graduation rate goal for first-time students. And these 2 are the goals set by the system. Only 8 CSU campuses have the same or higher 4-year graduation rate goal of 85% for transfer students, and only 11 have the 45% or higher 2-year graduation rate goal for transfer students. Equity gaps at 10 CSU campuses have widened in the 6-year graduation rate for first-time students, and at 9 CSU campuses in 4-year graduation rates for transfer students. Of course, as you all know, in a state as diverse as California, and in a CSU system in which 53% of its undergraduate students are Latinx, Black, and American Indian Alaska Native, there's simply no pathway for meeting all of the GI 2025 goals without significantly improving the success of URM students, as identified by the CSU. Without targeted, informed, and differentiated strategies that really provide the supports for Latinx, Black, and American Indian Alaska Native students to succeed, the CSU will fall short of meeting 3 of the 4 goals in the GI 2025 and will not have closed the gaps by race and ethnicity, an important goal that was a part of this effort. This, of course, would be devastating, not just for the students whose untapped talent has not been fully realized, but for the state of California and our nation, given the important need for educated workers of all backgrounds. So now to share specific findings, please join me in welcoming Dr. Vikash Reddy, our Vice President of Research. And I also just really want to thank our Senior Research Analyst, David Drummer, who's been essential in the analysis that we've been able to prepare through this report for each of you. Thank you, Dr. Reddy.
Thanks so much, Michelle. And I would just like to add my thanks to David Drummer and also our research fellows who have been part of the research process here at the campaign as we put together these data. I want to remind folks just to take a minute to get to the website and share the report, take a look at the report. Michelle's given you some of the key highlights. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into the data, but the report itself goes even deeper than we're going to be able to go in this presentation. And I would note also in the appendix of the report, you can find campus by campus summaries of some of the data points that we're going to be discussing today. And so please, again, take a minute with that. And those summaries also will be available on our website individually on the report landing page. So the first slide that I'm showing here looks at first-time graduation rates for first-time freshmen on a 4-year and 6-year basis. And we've done a couple of things here. We've shown the 4-year graduation rate for the CSU population as a whole, and you'll see that on the top row. Those red dots, the 19% represents the 4-year graduation rate for first-time full-time students in 2015. The scroll to the right of that, the 35%, represents the 2022 graduation rate. And so you can see right there tremendous progress, as Michelle mentioned, nearly doubling in the graduation rate, the 4-year graduation rate overall. We put a dotted or a dashed line there at what the CSU identifies as an interim target en route to the Grad Initiative 2025 goal, which is that darker red line of 40%. And we know that that red scroll is past that line, right? We think that's encouraging progress. Now, the next 3 lines are the ones that give us a little bit more pause and cause for concern. The gray line is the graduation rates for non-underrepresented minority students, right? And so as Michelle mentioned, underrepresented minority students in this category consist of Latinx students, Black students, and American Indian Alaska Native students. And so when we compare, and that's more than half of the population coming into the CSU, both as freshmen and as transfer students, and we'll get to the transfer picture in just a second. But when you compare rates here, we see that previously those graduation rates for non-underrepresented minority students were more than double those of underrepresented minorities, 25% to 12%. And we've seen a rising tide for all populations here, right? A growth of about 14 percentage points for underrepresented minorities, but a growth of roughly 17 percentage points for not underrepresented minorities. So in spite of the rising tide, we see, as the report is titled, a persistent divide. What you're going to see on the row below, the blue set of dots, is the disaggregation for Black students specifically. Now, the reason that we do a disaggregation for Black students is that while we say that 56% of first-time freshmen in 2022 at the Cal State University were underrepresented minority, it was 52% Latinx and 4% Black students, right? And so we see an average of URM that is driven largely by the Latinx population. And so what we've done here is specifically break out the population of Black students. That isn't to say that we think things aren't important or Latinx outcomes aren't important. We just believe that in this particular report, that storyline isn't one that gets told very well. I would invite folks to head to our website and take a look at the state of higher education for Latinx Californians for a more in-depth portrait of that community, as well as the state of higher education for Black Californians, and we do one for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Californians. In which I think we also help make the case that there are populations within that group that also ought to be thought of as underrepresented minorities and supported as such. That's a conversation for a different time. I want to point to the outcomes for Black students at the CSU. We see here tremendous growth, right? From 9% of students graduating in 4 years or less to 24% graduating in 4 years or less. Right, tremendous growth, nearly 3 times the rate as before, but again, a persistent divide against their non-underrepresented minority peers. On the 6-year time horizon, the same graph shows, no, not quite yet, thank you. The same graph shows that graduation rates on the 6-year time horizon haven't risen quite as much. We've seen growth, but again, not quite as much. And what that tells us is that the university system has done a lot of great work on improving time to degree, but we think there's still a lot of work to be done on overall degree completion on that 6-year time horizon. A similar story here, we see growth for populations across the board, but a persistent equity divide in graduation rates. The next slide shows similar outcomes for transfer students. The graduation initiative has transfer student goals for a 2-year and a 4-year time horizon. On the 2-year horizon, we see growth on the general population from 31% to 40%. And that sort of growth is mirrored among both underrepresented minorities and non-underrepresented minorities. And we see far smaller equity gaps between those populations on the transfer 2-year horizon. I would note that when we disaggregate for Black students, we do see larger equity gaps. And so again, I think another piece of evidence here that it's important to do that further disaggregation and to really look deeply at populations and try to figure out how to better support them to graduation. Similar story on the longer term outcomes. We see growth there, but I think still a little bit short. We see, I think, more growth on these in terms of the long term than for first-time freshmen. But I would note that on both of these two goals, the system as a whole is below the interim target, not far below, but still a little bit below the interim target. And so we think, room for growth there and would encourage thoughtful progress there. We wanted to take a look at a deeper look at the goals that campuses were setting, right? So we've talked a lot now in this presentation about the system-wide goal of a 40% graduation rate for first-time freshmen on a 4-year level, a 70% goal for first-time freshmen at a 6-year time horizon. And for transfer students, we talk about a transfer goal of 2-year graduation rates and 4-year graduation rates. There are other goals associated with the initiative that involve closing the equity gaps, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those later. But the first thing that we wanted to do here at the campaign was just take a look at the goals the campuses are setting, right? Who's being ambitious? How ambitious are campuses being? And what we did on this first table is really just take a look at the campus level goals for each of those 4 time horizons and ask how they compare to the system level goals in each of the 4 categories. There are only 3 campuses that have goals on each of those 4 categories that are at or above the system goals in each of them, or across the board. And I'll note that for most of these campuses, their graduation rates were already quite high. I think in the case of San Luis Obispo, already above the system-wide target. And so while we do applaud the high goals, it is important to remember, where these campuses started. We think more concerning are the 8 campuses that have goals that are all below the system-wide average. And that concerns us because that means that at these campuses that might be setting a target of 30%, the system now is dependent on a weighted average for other campuses that have higher graduation goals, carrying essentially the system towards its average 40%. And we think that that's just the students at Dominguez Hills and Fresno and Humboldt and Los Angeles and Maritime and Northridge and Sacramento and San Marcos ought to have a goal for their graduation success that mirrors their peers and their counterparts at Chico, at Fullerton, at Long Beach, at Sonoma, at San Diego, and Sloan. Right, I think that for us is a value statement. And so you see in this that there is just a tremendous range and variation in goal setting across the board. And we believe that, if the system is going to set a system-wide goal of 40%, we want to see campuses holding themselves to a similar standard. The next slide shows us both the goal-setting variation and also some of the progress that's been made towards the goals that have been set. The campuses here are ordered according to the ambition of their GI 2025 goals. The gray dots on the far right of almost every line there represent the goals for GI 2025. The crimson dots represent the 2022 graduation rate, 4-year graduation rate for first-time students. And the lighter red dots on the far left represent the 2015 4-year graduation rate. So I think the first thing that strikes me here is one thing I've already mentioned, the variation in goals across the board. I think the second thing that strikes me here is the tremendous progress that has been made at pretty much each and every campus in terms of their 2015 to 2022 goal, right? And so, or their 2022 progress. And I think that's incredibly encouraging. And we see, however, that there's progress to be made. I think, you can see the system is there at the top level, 35% or so graduation rate in 2022, heading towards the 40% target. What we've done on the next slide, though, is reorder these campuses. It's the same exact dots, it's the same exact colors, but we've changed the order to show which campuses have had further growth, right? And so again, we put the system at the top, 16 percentage points of growth between 2020 2015 and 2022. At the higher end of the spectrum, San Jose, Long Beach, San Diego, Sacramento, all with more than 20 percentage points worth of growth in terms of graduation rates for first-time students on a 4-year horizon. But at other campuses, Channel Islands, 4% percentage points, I should say, Sonoma, Chico, San Francisco, Humboldt, East Bay, 10 or 11 percentage points. So some variation there in the amount of progress that's been made. We do a similar analysis for transfer students for goals set there and for their progress vis-a-vis those goals. Here we see that there are 11 campuses that have 2-year graduation goals that meet or exceed the system-wide goal. And in terms of progress, we see tremendous progress at most campuses towards meeting those goals. Again, we note that though not displayed on this graph, the system is a little bit behind its interim target. And so thinking about how to better support students towards, transfer students towards their graduation rates on a 2-year time horizon would be great. Similar analysis on the next slide, reorder these by the amount of progress that's been made. We see slightly smaller numbers here. Again, we would note that transfer rates started at a slightly higher rate in terms of graduation rate goals. But we see at the lower end 2 to 3 points worth of growth at Sonoma, San Luis Obispo, Channel Islands, and Bakersfield, closer to 20%, around 18, 19%, or 17, 18 at Monterey Bay and Los Angeles. So tremendous growth or variation in the amount of growth, but positively we see growth across the board. So I mentioned that, the targets, the 4-year, 6-year, and 2-year, 4-year graduation rates for transfer or first time and for transfer students are a big part of the GI 2025 goals. Another big part is closing equity gaps between underrepresented minority students and their non-URM peers. So here we take a look at equity gaps and we zero in on the 2022 rates. So at this slide, we have the graduation rates for the campus as a whole, and at the top level, as usual, we have the system-wide, and so the crimson dots are those campus or system-wide graduation rates. URM students displayed in orange, Black students with blue dots, and what we've done for campuses that have fewer than 50 Black graduates is to put them in a circle rather than a full dot, just to say, interpret with a little bit of caution. When you get to smaller population sizes, smaller changes can have larger impacts on percentages and percentage fluctuations. And so it is important to disaggregate and view the data, but it's also important to view it with just a little bit of caution. And we also note that on some of these graphs, there are fewer than 10 students in the graduating cohort. And so for privacy reasons, those numbers are suppressed. On this particular graph, you see that for Maritime, and they're denoted with an asterisk that will reappear in some of the next slides. And so again, I think one of the things that we see here, tremendous variation in terms of the gaps, but we do see some pretty persistent gaps across campuses in terms of URM, non-URM students, and further gaps on most campuses, wider gaps for Black students vis-a-vis their non-URM peers. This next slide shows a similar breakdown for the 2-year rate on transfer students. We see again, there's tremendous variation in the size of the divide, but there are some substantial equity gaps that have persisted through the graduation initiative and through last year's, the 2022 graduation rates. Again, I would invite folks to sit with the report. We have similar graphics on the 6-year time horizons and 6-year equity gaps for first-time students. We have a similar set of analyses for transfer students on the 4-year time horizon. There is incredibly important data there. I will reiterate the story there is a rising tide, persistent divide. And so, certainly that's the too long didn't read, but I would encourage folks to read it. One of the things that we thought was important, now I've shown you the 2022 equity gaps, but when we take a look at equity gaps, and like I say, the quest to close them, we note that in the system as a whole, it was 12.2 percentage point equity gap for this graph here shows the 6-year time horizon for first-year students. And that closed only to an 11.9 percentage point gap, right? And so not very much. There is, however, a much larger variation at the campus level. And so here we see 13 campuses between 2016 and 2022 have closed the equity gap, and that their line has moved from the dot, their arrow moves to the right. And that red line running down the center represents essentially an equity gap of 0, where URM and non-URM students have an identical graduation rate. So 13 campuses have moved that to the right. That means at 10 campuses that has moved to the left, indicating that equity gaps actually have increased or are larger now than they were in 2016. So that's concerning, and we think that particular focus should be paid there. On the transfer student level, we see 14 arrows moving to the right. Again, at the system-wide level here, we see actually that there's been very little progress in terms of closing it is much smaller than the first-time student gap, but the equity gap for transfer students has stayed pretty stuck at 2.2 percentage points. 14 campuses have decreased their equity gap in that their arrow has moved to the right. 9, it has moved to the left. I apologize, I don't have the list in front of me, but I know that's in our materials. Of the 8 campuses where equity gaps for both transfer students at a 4-year horizon and first-time students on a 6-year horizon have shrunk. And so I think some celebration at those 8 campuses is probably warranted. My apologies, I know I've gone pretty quickly through a lot of data, and as I mentioned, there is a lot more data in the report. I do, like I say, invite folks to download it, sit with it, share it on social medias, X, Y, and Z, with that hashtag rising tide, persistent divide. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle Siqueiros, who has thoughts on our path forward.
Thank you, Vikash. And just a reminder, the report is available. That was a lot of data. It's been over a year of research on our side, but I also just wanted to highlight that we believe that telling the disaggregated story was important, both by race and ethnicity and also by campus. And so in the report, starting on page 45, we have an appendix that provides you with every single one of the 23 campuses, and you can see their progress or lack of progress towards meeting the GI 2025 goals at the system level, as well as the ones that they defined and set for themselves. So thank you, Vikash, for that thorough overview. I did want to offer some recommendations. I think most of you who are familiar with the Campaign for College Opportunity know that we love data and the power of data to help inform good policy and practice. And that is our sole intent with the release of this report. We are strongly supportive of the fact that the CSU has led the nation, if not the world, in being ambitious and setting targeted goals for improving graduation rates and ambitious goals for closing the gaps. And we want to support and celebrate that as we highlight what more can and should be done. So at the state level, we really urge policymakers to continue to monitor and demonstrate their support for efforts to improve graduation rates and eliminate racial equity gaps that persist by requesting an annual report that shows progress towards GI 2025 with data fully disaggregated by campus and students' race and ethnicity. This data was not easy to find, and we would like the CSU to retire the use of URM and non-URM categories completely. They don't fairly and adequately tell the story of what's happening at each campus, and you can't be intentional about closing the gaps if you aren't disaggregating the data more fully. We also urge policymakers to maximize the multi-year funding increases contained in the CSU compact with Governor Gavin Newsom's administration. We urge the disaggregation of GI 2025 data by race and ethnicity as a condition of receiving their 5% annual funding increase, and to require the CSU to demonstrate progress for Black, Latinx, and other student subgroups in meeting the governor's 70% post-secondary educational attainment goal. At a system level, we urge the implementation of the CSU's Black Student Success Task Force recommendations to advance Black student success and elevate Black excellence including developing comprehensive enrollment, retention, and persistence strategies at all campuses. When we see those donut holes instead of full blue dots on the charts, we should be concerned. Why are there less than 50 students who are Black at any one of the CSU campuses? So we want to make sure that we're elevating evidence-based practices that promote Black student success and more. The system can also include progress toward increasing graduation rates and eliminating equity gaps as a clear measure of performance for CSU presidents during their annual 3- and 6-year reviews and as expectations when recruiting new campus leaders. People need to know that this is a part of their job and an expectation that we all have for their success. For campus leaders, it's imperative that they identify ambitious goals that align with the CSU system-wide efforts to meet the GI 2025 goals, and that they support the kind of campus-level staffing and structures necessary to bring those goals into fruition. We found it incredibly problematic that it seemed okay that at some campuses, they could have much smaller goals than other campuses. As Jesse said at the beginning, we think no matter where you live, you should have access to strong support systems at whatever CSU campus you choose to attend. Campuses should also disaggregate their URM and non-URM data to ensure full understanding of both progress and gaps that can inform investments, intentional practices, and strategies to improve graduation rates and eliminate equity gaps. This is just an overview of the recommendations, so I encourage you all to read the full report to learn the steps that key leaders can and must implement if we're to create a system that equitably supports every student to succeed, regardless of their race, ethnicity, gender, income, or zip code. So again, thank you for joining us, and I'm glad to turn it over now to Senator Josh Newman.
Thank you again, Michelle and Vikash, for that wonderful overview of the report findings. I want to underscore that while we recognize there is much to celebrate with the notable progress in improving graduation rates, we have in the data reinforced this need for courageous action to ensure that all students are supported, particularly our Black, Latinx, and American Indian, Alaskan Native students. I so appreciate Michelle's statement again that no matter where you live in the state of California, you should have equitable access to an opportunity to reach your college dreams. I know that we have a lot of chat going on in the chat board and that you are anxious to engage in the conversations and dig into the data more deeply. I promise you we'll be coming back to you and taking your questions shortly. But first, as Michelle shared, we are fortunate to have special remarks from Senator Josh Newman, the chair of the Senate Education Committee. In addition to being chair of the Senate Education Committee, I will say that he is a strong champion on issues of college affordability, of student access, and in particular, equitable pandemic recovery for students in these challenging times.
Hello, I'm California State Senator Josh Newman, and I have the honor of representing California's 29th Senate District, as well as serving as chair of the State Senate's Committee on Education. Having now had the chance to preview the key findings of the Campaign for College Opportunities Progress Report on CSU's Graduation Initiative 2025, I'd like to share a few of my thoughts on the data presented and about how the CSU system can reinforce its investments toward improving graduation rates and racial equity across its 23 campuses. First and foremost, I'm very encouraged by the CSU's demonstrated system-wide progress toward achieving the target graduation metrics established by the Graduation Initiative. According to the data between 2015 and 2022, the four-year graduation rates of first-year CSU students nearly doubled. In the same period, the six-year graduation rates of first-year students, as well as the graduation rates of transfer students, also saw significant improvements toward the initiative's ambitious goals, with fully half of CSU schools achieving measurable gains with respect to the academic success of students of color on their campuses. Despite this important and laudable progress, the study also identified persistent remaining equity gaps across the CSU among student subgroups such as Black, AAPI, and Hispanic students. This is clearly unacceptable. Further, while system-wide graduation rates have risen, some individual campuses have seen improvements at very different rates. As the Campaign for College Opportunity notes in its report, if progress continues only at the current rate, the CSU system is likely to fall short on all but one of its stated graduation initiative goals. The report also outlines various policy and administrative actions that the legislature, the CSU Chancellor's Office, the CSU Board of Trustees, and campus leaders should consider taking to optimize the current trends around the graduation initiative. Among its critiques of the initiative so far, the report also noted a number of data reporting issues that hinder the analysis and creation of mechanisms to improve academic engagement across various groups of students. As the study points out, without the disaggregation of graduation initiative data by race and ethnicity, it will remain difficult to track progress and craft targeted strategies for increasing graduation rates among specific student subgroups. From a policymaking standpoint, additional and more comprehensive information, as well as the oversight to ensure it, could better inform decisions by both the university system and the legislature about the distribution and application of resources toward closing equity gaps. From my own perspective as a member of the state Senate, I'm especially interested in how statewide economic trends have either encouraged or hampered the growth of California's higher education system in various ways. Across the state, for example, we continue to see a dire need for affordable housing in college communities, with tens of thousands of CSU students still struggling to find and maintain stable housing, and with a significant number experiencing homelessness. Cal State Fullerton, the largest CSU campus in both a Hispanic and AAPI serving institution, has already begun to address this need, restructuring its physical master plan to transition the university from a commuter to a residential campus by the year 2039. That horizon is obviously far beyond that of the 2025 graduation initiative, but a new 600-bed student housing campus has already been constructed on campus at CSU Fullerton and will serve CSU Titans for generations to come. Sadly, as a result of financial constraints and employment demands driven largely by the cost of housing, many CSU students still find themselves forced to enroll in part-time course loads. As a consequence, many of these students face a long and often bumpy road on the way to the completion of their studies. By expanding affordable student housing opportunities on the CSU's campuses, we can ensure that more students will be able to maintain full-time course loads and fully immerse themselves in their educational experience while working toward a four-year graduation. I personally remain hopeful that, despite the state's current fiscal challenges, higher education institutions across California will be able to continue making progress on the construction of student housing and other essential capital projects. By being intentional on achieving progress on equity gaps in higher education, we will honor the contributions and successes of California's entire diverse population while improving the prospects and prosperity of the state as a whole. There is clearly a great deal of work remaining to be done, but I want to commend the Campaign for College Opportunity's commitment to exploring these issues and for the exceptional analysis done in the study and the data it yielded, as well as for the opportunity to address you all today as part of this webinar. I look forward to being your partner and your advocate as we move forward together. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Newman. We appreciate your excellent remarks, but in particular, your leadership and your willingness to confront the very real challenges that our students are facing today. Now, please join me in welcoming our incredible panel of education equity leaders. We're joined by San Diego State Associated Students Vice President of External Relations, Melvin Ridley III, Professor and co-founding director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab at San Diego State University, Dr. Frank Harris III, and Associate Vice Chancellor of Student Success and Inclusive Excellence at the CSU Chancellor's Office, Dr. Jennifer Basile. Thank you all for taking time to be with us today for today's important conversation.
Great to be here.
Well, let's just jump right in. I know that our participants are eager to hear from you. I thought we'd start by focusing on some of the progress that has been noted in the report. We know that there is much to celebrate about the CSU's GI 2025 initiative. In particular, we celebrate the intentionality with which the goal setting happened and the very real improvements that we saw in graduation rates. I'd love to kick this off by asking Dr. Harris and Dr. Bazil to share why GI 2025 and its success is so vital to students in the state.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. I'm happy to start if that's okay, Dr. Bazil. But whenever we're trying, I think we need to start and recognize and understand where we were a decade ago with regard to student success, right? As a system, we were not meeting expectations and living up to the promise, what we promised students and what we promised Californians about having access to affordable higher education that will allow students to complete and meet their goals, right? And so we had to do something in order to change the trends and to address some of these persistent gaps that we've seen in student success, right? That's important. And so whenever you're trying to do something that's going to impact an entire system, right, but nearly 500,000 students, you have to be intentional. You have to set goals that are clear. You have to galvanize focus, attention, and resources, all headed in the same direction. And that's why we're able to see, quite frankly, some of the gains that we saw that's been reported and outlined, both in this webinar and in the report, right? So when we see, a 16-point increase in four-year graduation for first-time students, that's substantial. And some of the other gains that we saw as well. And so, yeah, I don't know that we would have saw that without having a graduation, a GI 2025 to anchor and focus us.
Yeah, thanks. I just would want to say two things really quickly. One is I would want to offer a slight reframe from the language of celebration, right? And I would probably try and replace that language of celebration with a framing around deep appreciation for the important work that has unfolded on the campuses, the important work that students have done. We say all the time that in these metrics are the lives and livelihoods of individual students, and we really want to hold that dear. But I think the other thing to say is at the start of this initiative, nationally, the conversation around student success looked very different. And at that time, the CSU was really bold in its curiosity to not only reflect and evaluate deeply, but also to measure and to assert and to aspire publicly toward closing equity gaps. And so I think that part of the importance of this initiative is the momentum that it has given the national work and the national conversation, but more specifically, the campus level work and the system-wide work to really intentionally, consistently, and continuously evaluate, measure, and engage in action to really make a concerted effort toward reaching these goals.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bazil. And I have to say, I found it very powerful that you talk about not celebrating, but recognizing appreciation for the work that is occurring on campuses. To this idea that Dr. Harris, this initiative anchoring compelling action by providing a critical time. Little bit more about what GI 2025 has taught you about the importance of establishing goals.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Jesse, I only heard part of the question, but
could you tell what this initiative, how the importance of this ambitious goals?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm still having trouble.
I'll jump in, Dr. Harris. I think the question is really focused on why is it important to set ambitious goals for the CSU? Can you speak to that?
Yes, of course. Well, we have to set ambitious goals because ambitious goals are what makes folks really focus and to come up with ambitious strategies and to stretch themselves and to do things and to be innovative and to do things that they hadn't done before. right? And I think it's important to recognize in 2015, we had a 19%, right, four-year graduation rate for first-time students. And that's first of all, I think everyone would find that unacceptable. But secondly, it means that we have a lot of work to do in order to get that to at least a satisfactory rate, right? A rate where we'd all be, we'd all be comfortable with. And so to do that, right, to move an entire system, there has to be, very targeted and intentional progress towards a very specific outcome, very specific goals. And I think GI 2025 does that for us, right? It provides some anchor, it provides milestones, it provides benchmarks, it lets us know where should we be, in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and so on and so forth.
Dr. Bazil or Dr. Harris, if you could also add, on closing the gaps, there's not been, good movement, some progress at some campuses, but can you speak to that? We can set goals, right? And then if we never meet them, then that's also problematic.
Go ahead, Dr. Harris. Looks like you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was, but I'm happy to follow you on this one. So, yeah.
Well, I think that with regard to the equity goals, I think that part of what we have really found is that there is a continuous process of learning about what is working and where really improvement can be made. In 2021, there were 5 equity pillars, and consistent concerted work around those pillars has been introduced. There's been a great deal of focus on the equity gaps, but I would want to just say that I think that even if we fall short, I'm not excusing us not reaching our goals or stepping back from that at all. But I do think that there is something very important about setting a clear target and then really learning from and iterating on what we can do moving forward to continue to make improvements in the work. So, I think that it's really an area of conversation and continued analysis to really understand, well, what happens if organizations fall short or don't quite meet the mark, and what do we do and how do we respond? Because I think as much as there is a caution in student success work against deficit framings for students, I think that there's an equally important and less talked about conversation about deficit framing for institutions, right? If institutions start from a challenged place and they are making progress, I think that we still have to, again, have that deep appreciation for the work while we engage to push forward and to continue to make impact and momentum.
Thank you, Dr. Bazil. We had some internet issues for a moment, but I'm pleased to say we now have Melvin back with us. And I think we would be remiss if we didn't have his perspective as a student who lives this data every day. Would love, as we talk about the unacceptable racial equity gaps, to hear from you, Melvin, about the actions that you'd like to see campuses and policymakers taking to address these divides.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the question, and sorry about the internet issues. I think personally for me, I think one of the first steps is making sure that at base, our classrooms are welcoming spaces, that our professors, our teachers, and our leaders understand what it means to create a diverse and equitable and an inclusive environment for students. If we as students are entering classrooms where maybe the material or the curriculum we are faced with isn't welcoming or possibly alienates students within that classroom, as a student, why should I be expected to go to that class? If that class personally makes me feel attacked or makes me feel unwelcome in that space, I am not going to feel comfortable going into that classroom. And not being able to pass that class, not being able to feel comfortable or take the test or turn in the necessary material that I need to class will affect my grade and in turn affect the amount of time that I'm spending within the classroom and my success within the school. I think it's also important for universities to create safe spaces for our underrepresented students. Personally, at CSU, I know we've found success within our Black Resource Center, our Native Resource Center, our Undocumented Resource Center. These centers have provided our students with spaces where they can come and find students that look like them, find professors and faculty administrations that are willing to advocate for their needs, and just a general space for them to be themselves, for them not to feel the pressure of maybe being the only Black student in the classroom, to be around other Black students and make them feel like they have a family to turn to on campus. I also think it's important for our university and the system to realize that obtaining an education is so much more of a holistic process than simply going to class. As was mentioned previously, there are so many other issues that go into, I guess, being a student on campus. We have to keep in mind that all the classes, the current students within universities now are, I guess, outcomes or the groups that suffer from the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of these students now have seen most of or a good chunk of their life online or locked down in the classroom. The mental health or the other outcomes that can come out of this pandemic, we can't put a time date on when students will ever be able to adjust. This can stretch from 5, 10, maybe even 15 years. So we have to ensure that we're providing those students with the resources they need to properly adjust in the classroom. We also must understand that students at first need their basic needs, their housings, their food, their ability to take care of themselves accommodated before they can be successful in a classroom. If I, as a student, cannot basically feed myself or feel like I have the proper nutrition or the energy to go to class, I will not go to class. I know there's students on campus that are going to prioritize working, going to their jobs, going to multiple jobs before they go to the classroom because I need to be able to pay my rent so I have somewhere to live. My ability to live somewhere and sleep somewhere and obtain food comes first before obtaining my education. So if we really want to ensure that our students are being successful, we must first start by ensuring that every student has the proper resources and the basic needs before we can even focus on getting the students in the classroom and changing the classrooms and ensuring that they have the proper curriculum they need to be successful.
Melvin, thank you so much for your honesty, your brilliance, and your very sincere comments. I want to touch upon a few items that you called out that I think are so critical. The role of the classroom and ensuring that our students, in particular, our Black students, feel welcomed in the classroom, that they have safe spaces on their campuses, that in order to ensure that we are supporting our students in succeeding academically, we have to make sure that their basic needs are being met, right? So that they can lean into academics knowing that they're not going to be in fear of losing their housing, et cetera. I want to get back to some of that with our other panelists. What are the best practices to these very important points that Melvin raises that we know should be scaled across campuses to better support our students?
Yeah, I would love, thank you, Melvin. By the way, it's a pleasure to serve on this panel with you as our ARIS president here at San Diego State. But I think Melvin raised some real important points about the role of faculty, and I would even broaden that to the role of all educators at an institution. And so the three things stand out for me. Awareness. I often wonder, how many educators on the campus really understand how grossly disproportionately impacted Black students are, for example, right? Do they understand, what the equity gaps are, not only at their system, but also at the institution and even down to their college or department. And then I think the second point is accountability. And so, how do we make sure that folks are not only aware and understand, the level of disproportionate impact and inequity and who's disproportionately impacted, but also have some solid measures of accountability, right? So when we're hiring faculty, for example, we shouldn't just be hiring faculty because of the research expertise. We should also be hiring faculty who have some demonstrated track record of success in being able to meet the needs, the teaching and learning needs of students who are disproportionately impacted at the institution, right? I think, Michelle made an important point around the accountability for executives at our institutions, right? How do we make sure that the success of Black students or all students who are disproportionately impacted, that's reflected in how executives are evaluated on an annual basis, for example. And so I think those two things, awareness and alignment, are the things that really stand, awareness and accountability, pardon me, the two that really stand out for me as ways where we can really, we really need to be more intentionally focused moving forward in this initiative.
Yeah, I would just add really quickly that I think that part of what Melvin really encapsulated in a really powerful and impactful way are two key concepts that I really hold dear, and I know many other people who do this work hold dear. One is the idea of institutional transformation, right? How do we create the conditions on campus to see the kind of well-being and thriving that we want for our students? In this context, ABC identified African, Black, and Caribbean students. But I think that the other framing that Melvin really offers that is useful to really inform this work is the framework of servingness. Right? How do we serve students? How do we engage students? What is the student experience like? And I think that this holistic view, not just about the learning environment, although the entire campus is a learning environment, the entire college experience, university experience is a learning environment. There are many factors besides the curriculum that are shaping and impacting what is happening with students. And the final thing that I would say that I really have appreciation for is the insights around COVID-19, right? And the way in which we are still having to learn and adapt to the way in which that experience impacted students, but also faculty and staff on these campuses, and the support structures and the ways in which we need to engage moving forward. So just a lot of appreciation for what Melvin really framed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bazell. So we're actually going to continue with you and also have Dr. Harris respond to this before wrapping up with one more question for Melvin. And this is because so much of the focus of the findings are around the challenge related to URM versus non-URM and the inequities that frankly it masks. So Dr. Bazell, I would love to first start with you and really ask you what CSU is doing to ensure that they are disaggregating data in a way that allows us to capture students and their race and ethnicity and use that data to ensure in real time we're instituting interventions and support.
Sure. So I think that there's just a small point, but an important point of clarification. The underrepresented minority category is not a category that belongs to the CSU, right? We took it up, but it is a legacy metric that was used at the start of GI 2025. And there was a challenge, right? So as we started the work with this imperfect framing, would we change midstream in order to, change what would be perceived as the goalpost, right? And so I think that there has been evidence that almost from the beginning, there has been disaggregation of data, right? That we are not just looking at this underrepresented minority category and, not really digging deeper, disaggregating and, using data in a dynamic way to really understand the full range of student experiences. So I think that that's the first thing. And I think that the second thing is, again, based on what we have learned in this initiative, what emerges and what comes next is really super important. And there are many insights that we will be able to apply. And that conversation is coming up, but there will be many insights that we will be able to apply to really engage this question about how to make the data dynamic and how to really be able to put it in the hands of people who are the change makers on our campuses to really be able to do this work. So, I just want to say again that it's a legacy metric. And I think that there's a way in which we acknowledge that, if we were starting today, it wouldn't be the category that we used, but that's where we started.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And the acknowledgement that with this legacy metric, it has had problems that have unfortunately hindered progress in the way that we would like to see. Dr. Harris, would love to hear your reaction as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think when it comes to doing racial equity work, the more disaggregated we can be, right, the more fine-grained our measures can be, the more we can better understand, inequity, how it persists, where it's happening, what are the intersectionalities, right, that sort of exist with regard to inequity. And so, I would like to see us move to something that's more, that gives us a more transparent understanding of where we are as a system with regard to inequity and where we are, with the actual individual campuses. I appreciate Dr. Bazille's, framing and context around how do we, why are we using URM, and, how do we get to where we are, and, what might be some promise and potential for us moving away from it. But I think it's important to do, right? When those of you in the audience, when you get a chance to read the report, you'll get a chance to really see how being able to drill down and look at the experiences of Black students as one example, how it does give us a very different and a deeper understanding of disproportionate impact and inequity for that particular group of students, right? And so I think the more that we can do to continue to have similar analyses, and while understanding the respecting sort of how we got there and why we're here, that being important. But the more fine-grained and the more intentional we can be, and the more disaggregated we can be, I think the better served we'll be in being able to address the goals.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. And you're right. I mean, acknowledging when something is handed to us and it doesn't work, it's time to change, especially if it doesn't illuminate the very students we're fighting to serve. Melvin, I want to end with you because you have, such an important voice in this conversation. As I said earlier, the student perspective is at the heart of all of this, your experience. And I want to ask you about the recommendations. I thought Michelle did a really good job of talking about, this is not just data, this is a call to action. And so from a student perspective, what do you think of the recommendations should be uplifted, should be acted on urgently, and addresses those very core needs that you called out were preventing students from reaching their full potential?
Yeah, of course. I think if we're looking at the recommendations for some of our state policy makers, as I mentioned earlier, that ensuring that like the legislation and the budgets and proposals that they have for the CSUs encompass the needs for mental health, housing, basic needs, that these campuses are receiving funding that should go directly to those resources, and understanding again that getting a student into the classroom is only a minuscule part of a student's journey. That understanding that students need multiple accommodations in order for them to be successful, for them to obtain that degree in 4 years or complete that degree in 6 years. And we as a system and as leaders on our campuses must understand that, again, as mentioned earlier, there's more of a holistic, approach or responsibility that we have to students, other than, again, providing them with the classroom. Our role goes longer. It extends longer to basically ensuring that these students are successful in their outside lives and that they're able to feel comfortable and welcomed on these campuses. I think it's also important, again, that campuses review their standards and ensure that the goals that they're setting are not basically below any standards that we'd set, or the highest standard. Every standard should basically be struggling to explain it, but everyone should have higher standards. We shouldn't be able to set standards that are below a minimum. Campuses must always be striving to reach their best goals, and we can't, basically trying to shoot for the stars, I guess. We can't limit ourselves and limit our goals. We all must be striving to be the best that we can be. I think it's also important, again, to separate this data and understand that, are we truly reaching the students that need the most support? As we know, CSUs and the goals of these universities were designed to support these underrepresented groups. We are a system that is designed to cater to some of the groups that have a hard time, to many of these first-year students, to students coming from struggling backgrounds. And if we can't effectively identify how to successfully support these students, then we are failing as a system. We're failing to reach our goal, and we're failing to succeed in our purpose as being an institution.
Absolutely. Melvin, so well said, and grateful for every perspective that you bring into this conversation. It is complex, but without that intentionality and that myriad approach, we're not going to see the changes that students demand and frankly deserve. So we're going to jump right into our questions from the audience. We have had, as our wonderful panel was responding to the series of questions that Michelle and I were positing to you, we were having some rich chat in the chat board. So we're going to start with a first question that I think is really relevant given the egregious decision of SCOTUS on race-conscious admissions, banning race-conscious admissions. And I think that, we have much that we can say as a result of Prop 209 in California that can be learned from. So the first question is, Do some of the recommendations run up against Prop 209 constraints, such as developing a comprehensive enrollment strategy for Black students? And that was actually a recommendation that was lifted out of the Black Student Success Report. Frank or others? Vikash?
Well, as I said in the chat, I would say absolutely not. None of the recommendations here are going to run afoul of state or federal law. Let's be clear about what the Supreme Court said in its recent decision. It said that race and ethnicity should not be a factor in admissions. Prop 209 talks about policy decisions based on race and ethnicity. Nothing prohibits colleges and universities from creating an enrollment plan or an outreach strategy, from ensuring that they're visiting high schools in neighborhoods that have larger Black populations or Latinx populations or populations with underrepresented Asian American, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander populations, American Indian Alaska Native populations, right? These are pieces of a meaningful strategy and not violations of any law or policy making doctrine. And just to reiterate that on the support front, even after enrollment, nothing prohibits colleges and universities from differentiating instruction and support, from targeting their efforts towards students based on needs, right? Based on common needs and based on what students are showing as their, their academic, their social, their own personal backgrounds. So no, absolutely not. Campuses, leaders are in bounds to, and frankly should be thinking about the racial and ethnic composition of their campuses. They should be, collecting and presenting and disaggregating these data along the lines that we've talked about here, as well as we've seen in the chat, along lines for gender. These are important questions, and like I say, the law does not prohibit these strategies.
Dr.
Thank you.
Brazil, how do you answer that question at your campuses? And Dr. Harris, I'd love to hear you respond to that as well.
Sure. I mean, I think that we have been working in the context of Proposition 209 for quite a while. I think that, frankly, it's an interesting shift in the national conversation about privilege and selectivity in college admissions, which is a different conversation than the one that we're having today. But I think that it just amplifies the importance of the work at the CSU and at the campuses to really continue in the mission and in the purpose of what we've been doing. So, it's a tough and challenging moment. I know how impacting it is for people to receive that decision in a national conversation and in a national context. But I think that the good news is that the work really continues and that there's a lot of good foundation for the work within the California State University system.
Yeah, and I would agree. The only other perspective that I would add to what my colleagues have already shared is, as painful and awful and unfounded as the recent Supreme Court ruling around race-conscious admission was, one takeaway that perhaps gives us a sliver of hope is that they did say that the decision does not preclude a student from talking about how race has impacted their educational trajectory, life experiences, right? And things that might be important for a college or a university to consider when making admissions decisions, right? And so I do think, at least for now, there's still, some opportunity to understand how race, how we can be, maybe racially informed about a student's journey and how it might help us make some good decisions about admitting students.
Thank you, Dr. Harris.
Yep.
So this next question that we're going to ask really gets to one of the themes of the report, which was the wide variation from campus to campus. So, one of our participants wants to know if there are commonalities between the campuses that have lower graduation rates and compared to those at the top. For example, non-impacted campuses is one of the factors for differing goals. And do you have any insights as to commonalities and what could be learned?
I think that part of the challenge is that there are so many dynamic factors that go into outcomes that are unfolding on these campuses that it would be hard to pinpoint just one in terms of commonalities or in terms of differences. And so I would say right now that the short answer is this is really complex work. And I almost feel like we could have a whole nother webinar on all of the data side by side for all of the campuses. It's really tough. It's really, really tough.
I would add, I don't,
Dr. Harris.
yeah, I don't know that I have a full understanding of what, all 23 campuses are doing, but I think, our colleague on the panel, Melvin, helped us understand, we know what are some best practices in supporting student success, right? We understand how important it is for students to experience and feel a sense of belonging and be welcomed at an institution. We know how important it is to have safe and welcoming communities like a Black Resource Center, for example. We know that, what faculty do or choose not to do in the classroom makes a big difference, right? We understand the importance of supporting students around basic needs and, and those, making sure that they have the resources that they need in order to be fully invested and be successful. And so I would suspect or imagine and would love to know, how do some of those factors show up in what we're seeing around the campuses that seem to be making, more measurable progress in other campuses in the system.
Yeah, I just want to circle back and say, in the GI 2025 initial framing, there was a set of 6 operational priorities, and then there are equity pillars that also emerge. So it's not like the work is so diffuse or that there are not lanes in which this work is unfolding. There are, but I think that I was trying to point more to drawing conclusions or making causation about certain factors, because there are so many dynamic factors at play here. But I also agree with Dr. Harris and Melvin with regard to the broad categories of concern and areas of concern where we can work and look for sure.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we can agree that there are many factors to take into consideration and that we need to act more urgently to scale what we know works. And we do have some evidence-based practices that should be invested in and scaled for the benefit of students across the state. I want to wrap up with a question for all of our panelists. In particular, I want to hear from you too, Melvin. As we're looking ahead past Graduation Initiative 2025, what happens next? Will new goals be set? I mean, to your point, Dr. Bazil, how are we learning from the failures and challenges and what worked in our past efforts with GI 2025? And how can we collectively shape this next iteration of the work on behalf of our students?
I'll be brief so that we can all hear from Melvin and others. This is really an inflection point in this work. The work is not stopping. I think that what's exciting is we have the opportunity to really learn from what is going on with regard to Graduation Initiative 2025, and then look to the next 10 years past that or more. I think that it is more imperative than ever that we continue to have a data-driven, deeply engaged conversation about not just outcomes, but real-time milestones that help us understand what is unfolding in the student experience and on our campuses in service of institutional transformation towards student success. I'll stop there, but I really do think that it is an important moment, but it's also an exciting moment. And I don't see any indication that we are doing anything but doubling down, moving forward, and investing even more deeply in the work.
And I would just add briefly, I think in 2025, we'll know where we are with regard to this initiative. And I think at that point, it's, we really need to get an understanding of what are the state's workforce needs, and, what do we need our college graduates, to be able to do when they complete, and, to what degree do we see that happening with our graduates? And do we have the graduates we need? Do we have the diversity and representation we need? And then that should inform whatever the next set of goals or whatever the next initiative is and looks like.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's important to continue moving forward and saying that 2025 is not the stop for this graduate initiative. What can we do to continue to improve and prepare our students for the workforce? I think it's also important to get creative and let's expand it. Let's do a housing initiative 2035. What percentage of our students are struggling to find houses now, and how can we improve that? How can we restructure What resources can we pump into the CSU systems to decrease that number, to ensure that our underrepresented students are effectively finding housing, are effectively finding places to live by campus. So again, they're successful in continuing their education. Even expanding to mental health initiative 2035. What percentage of our students now are struggling with anxiety and stress and are having a variety of other mental health issues in the classroom? And what can we do to decrease that number, to help these students to increase the resources that we need? I think if we are going to move forward, there's no point in, I guess, continuing. If we're just going to continue with the graduate initiatives, let's increase it. Let's think bigger. How can we holistically improve the CSU system and our lives for our students outside of graduation initiatives as well? There's so much room for improvement that we can have within the CSU systems. Let's continue to better ourselves even more.
I love the largesse of your vision, Melvin, and I think you're right. I mean, it speaks to the point that Dr. Brazil also mentioned about the urgency for transformation. So thank you for all of your comments and perspectives. As it was said, we could absolutely have another separate webinar and dig into these questions even further, but appreciate what you brought to the table as part of this important conversation. As we near the end of the program, we have an opportunity to hear from one additional ally in this critical work. I want you to please join me in welcoming Peter Taylor, who is going to be sharing some closing reflections. Peter, as many of you know, has been a student-centered, equity-minded leader, previously serving as a trustee on the CSU Board of Trustees and formerly as president of the ECMC Foundation, a nationally focused foundation working to improve higher education for career success among underserved populations through evidence-based innovation. Welcome, Peter. Thank you so much for taking your time to be with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Jesse. I appreciate the chance to visit with everybody. And, you know, in 2015, I was actually a trustee on the task force that set these goals and objectives, that had a robust discussion on how ambitious could we be. And there was a lot of concerns about possibly setting a four-year graduation rate in the 40% range. Lots of folks weren't sure we could achieve that at CSU. And so when I look at this report, frankly, I think it's mostly good news. I think there's huge momentum, as Dr. Brazil suggested, on most every one of our campuses in one way or another. And I think that is, in fact, something to celebrate. It is really hard, really hard for large organizations to pivot. And I think Dr. Brazil mentioned institutional transformation is really tough. And that is what CSU has done. In a matter of a few years, a lot of people, faculty, staff, have rethought the way they approach their work, where they allocate their resources, to take the CSU from focusing on admissions and attendance to completion. And I think that is something that is really important to acknowledge and to thank those people who led that effort. Going forward, though, I think there are a couple of key messages that are important to emphasize. One, to Governor Newsom, Senator Newman, and his colleagues in the legislature, your investments in GI 2025 are working. Please continue these investments well into the future. And to the CSU, a refocus of attention on underrepresented students, particularly Black male students, is of critical importance. While I was president of ECMC Foundation, we launched a Men of Color initiative under the leadership of our senior program officer, Saul Valdez, and gave CSU about $1 million grant to focus on their African-American students, particularly the students of color who are male. And there is real excitement in the philanthropic community over the kinds of things that CSU is doing and the momentum they've had. So what I think, and I think if there's a final message I would leave with you, Jesse, and to your audience, is that the message to newly appointed Chancellor Garcia is that I think CSU can stretch further. Now is the time to start to think about what the goal should be for GI 2030. And thinking about some of those holistic strategies that Melvin mentioned, including a refocused effort on infrastructure and student housing, to ensure that the momentum that we built up over the last 7 or 8 years continues well into the future. It's possible. CSU's clearly shown they can do it. And as a former trustee, I'm thrilled to see how much progress they've made, and am optimistic, frankly, that they will continue on the right track.
Thank you so much, Peter, for your leadership and really a lifetime of dedication to student success. I love what you said about the shift in mindset from access to focus with equal intensity on student success. I remember years ago when even talking about a 4-year graduation rate was a challenging conversation. And so I love that you're leading our audience with this call to aim higher and this recognition that we have an incredible opportunity before us with an equity-minded leader like Dr. Garcia taking the helm of the CSU. I'm going to close out our conversation by just saying that we are so grateful to the panelists who took time to be with us today and all of you who have joined us virtually for this. Heard that there are strides that we should be appreciating at the 23 campuses across the state of Graduation Initiative 2025, but there are also unacceptable equity gaps that leave many Black, Latinx, Alaska Native students behind college dreams. We've also heard about the urgency of disaggregating data in order to have a full picture of the obstacles students are facing, and for our policymakers and higher education leaders to have the ability to better target their resources to vulnerable students. This was a point that we heard from as well, Melvin on. As a former colleague often would say, behind every data point is a student story. And the categorization of students as simply underrepresented minorities or non-URM devalues those experiences, creates invisible populations, and further perpetuates inequities. We know that the CSU can and must continue to deepen and actualize its bold commitment to improving graduation rates with an equally intense commitment to eliminating racial equity gaps, building upon the GI 2025's trailblazing work. While significant progress has been made, more can be done, as each and every one of our speakers have said today. We also know that it will require everyone who is a part of today's conversation to lean in and ensure that we are taking courageous and urgent actions to minimize the impacts of students who are being failed currently. We encourage you to read the report and support our efforts to disaggregate the data, scale proven practices, and redesign inequitable systems to better ensure that our Black, Latinx, and American Indian, as well as Alaskan Native students are supported and crossing the finish line at the CSU with the graduation degree to show for their work. We want to thank everyone again and continue to follow us on Twitter and our social media with hashtag G25 and hashtag Rising Tide Persistent Divide.